In his late teens, Mike became a Nazi. Now, only 6 years later, he is a supporter of Black Lives Matter, and it worries him deeply to think how close he came, at the angriest stage of his life, to going out with his gun and shooting people. When Mike locked eyes for a brief moment with the man who had just fallen to the ground, he could tell that he was going to die. It was a frantic night in downtown Oakland, California, and the wind was sharp with the sting of tear gas as it whipped palm trees up into a frenzy. 3 days after the murder of George Floyd, protests in support of Black Lives Matter were breaking out across the US. Mike had been protesting with his girlfriend, but as night fell and the police started firing rubber bullets and tear gas, they decided to leave. They were walking back to their car, along streets filled with the black smoke of burning rubbish bins, when they saw a white van pull up. Then they heard the gunshots. The van pulled away as a man in uniform slumped to the ground. Mike moved towards him, trying to remember the first aid training he had learned in the military. But a police car arrived and a jittery gun-wielding officer jumped out and ordered Mike to leave. Later he learned that Dave Patrick Underwood, a federal officer who had been guarding the courthouse, had died at the scene. More than a year on, it still haunts Mike that he couldn't do more to save him.
By coincidence, Mike had a connection to Underwood. He had been marching that day with members of his family. But he was also connected to the man who was later charged with his murder. Stephen Carrillo was a sergeant at the same California Air Force Base where Mike had enlisted just a few years earlier. And that wasn't all. Mike had a secret. At home in his wardrobe there was a uniform made of gray-green khaki fabric, with a Nazi symbol on the collar. Mike kept it hanging there to remind himself of the person he used to be. Someone who wanted to go out and kill people. Like Carrillo, Mike had fallen down the rabbit hole of extremism and become a follower of America's violent far-right. In the summer before Mike's final year at school, he watched as the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests rolled out across the US, but taking part was the furthest thing from his mind. "I thought they were Satan incarnate," he says. He had just met a new friend through a messaging group online. Paul invited Mike to visit his home, where he lived with his parents. It was an ordinary house on a quiet cul-de-sac in an upmarket suburb of a major US city. They were meeting to shoot some propaganda videos. Paul opened the door in full Nazi uniform. He took Mike straight to his garage. It was just like a clothing store for Nazis, Mike says. The walls were lined with weapons, ammunition, cartridges, and many guns. Paul had gathered a few other young men for the shoot. They loaded guns and ammunition into a truck and drove out to some nearby hills. "We were on a state park firing semi-automatic and automatic weapons, filming and running around in Nazi uniforms," Mike says. Then the park rangers appeared. Paul was annoyed. He was just kind of standing there, and he's not really having any of it. He's not wanting to listen to this government authority telling him that he cannot do what he thinks he's entitled to do, which is make videos and pretend to be the Wehrmacht. The Rangers confiscated all the guns they could see, but the boys had hidden some of them and just loaded them back in the truck once they were alone again. Then they went back to Paul's house and hung out with his parents, still wearing their Nazi uniforms. Mike was 17 and says he had become the perfect vessel for toxic extremism. He had spent his childhood in a small, rural, mostly white town. Days were spent kayaking on the lake or cycling around town with his tight-knit group of friends. Adults and kids would hang out together, and dinner parties and barbecues were spontaneous. It was a place where everybody knew everybody. But Mike's stepfather was an alcoholic who could lash out violently, and when Mike was 12 his mother got a divorce and moved with the children to another part of the country. Suddenly Mike was living in a sweltering, multiracial urban neighborhood, and he hated it. There were people there who didn't look like anything that I had ever seen before. The food was different, the water tasted different, everything just completely different. They were also much less well off now, and the stepfather, who Mike had been close to, despite his violent outbursts, never kept a promise to visit the children. All this made Mike angry, and he found an outlet for that anger in the alt-right. Encouraged by the father of a friend, Mike began listening to right-wing talk show host Sean Hannity, and when he searched for similar content online, he found alt-right videos and podcasts on Facebook and YouTube. Social media algorithms were already creating what is known as the rabbit hole effect, leading him to content that became more and more extreme. Here he was told, for example, that divorce was a Jewish conspiracy meant to destroy the ideal white family. For whatever reason, for me that was easier to believe than that my stepdad was a degenerate alcoholic, he says. Eventually Mike migrated to the darkest corners of the internet, to white nationalist message boards on 4chan and 8chan. These sites were like a social club for racists, Nazis, and white nationalists, where people could say the N-word while getting to know one another, Mike says. He started exchanging messages with a group of neo-Nazis in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that is how he ended up on Paul's doorstep that summer afternoon. I was just looking for a place to put all my anger, Mike says. And it found a perfect home. A year later, Mike finished school. When he didn't get into his preferred universities, he said he would join the Navy instead, but his mother was against the idea. They settled on a completely different plan. Mike would go to a business school in London. In the UK, Mike expected bowler hats and gentlemen. His image of London was like something out of a Victorian novel. The reality was very different. His school was in Whitechapel, an area with a vibrant Muslim community. I was an 18-year-old, radical white nationalist, deeply fearful, deeply Islamophobic, and I arrived in Whitechapel at a flat that was sandwiched between the Royal London Hospital and the East London Mosque, he says. I definitely didn't see the diversity there as a positive thing. I looked at it as an example of everything that was wrong in the world.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe.